think we should go ahead with our final panel of the day. So this panel, we titled it State and Federal Policy Trends, Implications of Short-Term Pell and WIOA Reform. We have four great speakers lined up. We've got David Bain from the American Association of Community Colleges, Iris Palmer from New America, Brad Turner Little of the National Association of Workforce Boards, and our own Andrew Reamer. Andrew, I think that you're the only one who has a little visual aid. I think that we were thinking in terms of the order we were discussing over email that you might go first and kind of go through that. And then each of you will have, about 10, 15 minutes if you'd like to speak in one go, or if you want to kind of save some time, yield for a group discussion, however you're most comfortable.
Great.
All right, you can go. Yeah.
Hi, Andrew Reamer, research professor, George Washington University Institute of Public Policy, colleague with Kyle, with Lou, and a member of the NCRN team. The focus of a lot of my work is around the role of the federal government in producing numbers that people can use for research and analysis and policymaking. So what I'm going to do is walk you through some current events regarding federal data and analysis that relates to non-degree credentials. I've given John in the back a set of links, and we're just going to walk through them. So the National Science Board is the board of directors, if you will, of the National Science Foundation. They are charged by Congress with coming up with science and engineering indicators. And in the pre-PDF days, it was every 2 years was a big fat book. And now, of course, it's on a rolling basis. And the science and engineering indicators always dealt with workforce, but always from the bachelor's degree and above. And only in the last decade have they cared about what's called the skilled technical workforce, that's their term, which is people with a credential after high school, but not a four-year degree, associate's degree, certificate, certification, apprenticeship, and so forth. So this just came out. This is their analysis of the U.S. STEM workforce. And you can see on the left some of the chapter headings. And John, if you can just scroll where it says talent, if you just keep going and let people see that this covers the breadth. And this is just an FYI. This is using American Community Survey data. It's but there's an effort to understand the number of people in the skilled technical workforce. So that's the next one is under the Trump administration was an effort to do a STEM career pathways strategy. And the Biden administration is one of the few things that's continued from the Trump administration. This is the update that came out in April. And John, if you can click on where it says here, a little link there at the bottom of the 3 lines. Yeah, down at the bottom of the page. Yeah, nope. Okay, see what it says 23. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so this is a big fat 170 some, 50 some page report on STEM education strategic plan, the implementation of it. John, if you can go down to page 4 and just show people, this is the committee in charge, and I don't know how many people know Nafisa Owens, and you can see, so who's involved and also all the agencies. Now, John, if you can keep going to the table of contents and then click on it, just let people see Appendix 4 and 5, which take up the bulk of the report. Click on Appendix 4, and what you'll see is a 10-page inventory of federal STEM programs, some of which will be non-degree credentials and some of which will be undergraduate and graduate degrees. So you can see there's just some basic information here. And then, John, if you can go then 10 pages ahead to Appendix 5, you will see for each of these things 50 pages of detail. Um, th- there we go. So that's Appendix 5, and you can see the bullets here of the. This goes on for, 70 pages. Um, so it's a great resource. Now, the implication of people have heard of the CHIPS Act, right? So the federal government's in a new business, which is saying, okay, our model used to be we fund research and development, and because the private sector won't fund the really basic stuff, and we put that out there and let the market take care of it, and the market allows a lot of stuff to allow jobs to be created in China and other places. And so the CHIPS Act says we gotta try to keep jobs here. How do we create a domestic semiconductor industry? How do we create a domestic electric vehicle industry and batteries and so forth? So it's strategic industries. All of a sudden, industries matter, and every one of those industries has a industrial policies has a workforce strategy. So, how many people here know Rachel Lipson? Okay, Rachel Lipson was at the Harvard Workforce Program, and now she spoke at our conference a year ago, and she's in charge of workforce development for CHIPS. All these agencies have their own workforce people. All these agencies are not in the Department of Labor and the Department of Education. Most of these people don't have experience that you have, and have experience in WIOA and Perkins and so forth. They are learning on the job, and there's not a lot of. This is an attempt to start some coordination. So, FYI, each of these is kind of trying to figure out for themselves, and they could use. I would say, feel free to reach out to these people and let them know you exist. John, can we go to the next? Okay. N2s. How many people are not familiar with N2s? All right, everyone knows about N2s. N2s, this was alluded to earlier in the day. When I was at Brookings in 2009, I got some money from the Gates Foundation to organize a set of roundtables regarding what data are needed in the realm of education and workforce that we don't have right now. And the consensus for really what. So in that room, Sharon, and yeah, it's 50 people, and Sharon Boyven said, "I'm going with this," and she created Gemina. Gemina was this effort to come up with a way to capture from households who has non-degree credentials, and that became the adult training and education survey, and then that became N2s. So now NSF is working with NCES to do N2s, and the 2022 went into the field. 2022 data went into the field two and a quarter years ago. The data was supposed to come out in January of this year. The latest, if you see on the lower right there, it's September. N2s is an effort to, in the years that are not, where NSF is not carrying out the National Survey of College Graduates, to ask people about non-degree credentials. And it's 2022 was the first year, 40,000 households, supposed to triple in 2024 to 120,000 households, with going into the field in January 2024. The 2024 N2s seems to have disappeared. There is no evidence on the NSF website. I have written to folks at NSF to say what's going on, and I have not heard back. So there is radio silence from the National Science Foundation regarding the status of this really important program. And I asked them to give me a statement to tell you today. In the fall of 2023, they announced they were going to do the 2024, and they asked for public input regarding what's from the survey. And so, does anyone here have any information. It may, this is a new survey, you know, we know from the testing, the people who fill out the survey get flummoxed by the difference between certificates and certifications and things like that. So maybe there's some problems with the quality of the data. But once I found out, I will put it out on the NCRN. So unfortunately, and hopefully we'll see something useful in September. But you know, again, there's been an 8-month delay. Okay, next link. Oh, that's okay. No, you can skip that one. Okay, and so now I just some resources I want you be if you can click on industry models up at the top there. This is the competency model clearinghouse. How many people have not seen this before? All right, so you're all familiar with this. This is the Employment Training Administration, who is, John, if you can just scroll down so people can see the different industries and click on any one of these. It's a pyramid of jobs in an industry and the kinds of skills that are associated with it. And just if you can scroll over anything there, there you go. Okay. So ETA is always building this out. I just want to be sure you knew about that. John, the next bullet, please. Training provider results.gov. How many people are not aware of this item? Okay. This is the rolling up of the reports from the states and the WIBs regarding the outcomes of WIOA funded training. And Kyle is actually.
No, not in particular. I think we should kind of just wrap up the list
Okay.
of resources.
Then the PSEO, post-secondary outcomes, Census Bureau, which and John, if you can click on yeah, there you go, January 11th. So this is where Census is taking student records and linking them to UI wage records so you can see what happens to people after they graduate. And there's an Explorer that I think most of you are familiar with, and they just keep adding states. So they have about half the states now. And they are now, as of this year, rolling up all the data from a state so you can see the complete state picture for Colorado, for Texas, and so forth. I just want to be sure you know. Andrew Foote, for the people who want to follow up on this, FOOTE is the guy to contact the Census Bureau. Next bullet, please. Advanced Technological Education Program at NSF is the one NSF program that provides funding to train people in the skilled technical workforce. And all the grantees roll up all their information into this ATE Central. And again, this is just a website for your information about that particular program. Next bullet, please. Okay, last here is, this just came out, I think, a week ago. Somebody got the Labor Department to put the, if you can scroll down, John, please. There's a map here of the clean energy jobs being funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. And you can see it's by place and then by type of energy medium. You know, the job. WIOA, as you know, says, here's the money, it gives money to states and local workforce investment boards and says, you can spend this money to train people in in-demand occupations. And in-demand is, you designate an occupation as in-demand. And you have a lot of latitude to do that. Now, before industrial policy, ETA didn't really care. There was no need to look across the country to see what are the in-demand occupations nationwide, because everything was local. But now when you're doing chips and EVs and you have to think about competitiveness, I think there's an opportunity for ETA to take the occupations in demand by state and roll them up into a national map. So this is my pet project, to get ETA to do this. And I'm just showing you here, Washington State and Pennsylvania, every state has its own list of in-demand occupations with its own methodology. Separate question, should there be a national methodology? But for the moment, when there is, right, there's billions of dollars out there for WIOA training. Rachel Lipson at CHIPS needs bodies to fill the factories. It'd be nice to know what the WIBs think of, or what's in demand, and are semiconductor jobs in demand, or should they be? So there's not much interaction, and it's to let you know what might happen and what happen.
Thanks, Andrew. So I think we can go ahead and and I think we'll kind of do some. I think, or I think that each of you could say a little bit more about your respective organizations' kind of perspectives on some of the pressing policy issues affecting non-degree credentials. Brad, do you want to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Brad Turner-Little. I'm the president and CEO of the National Association of Workforce Boards. I thank you for the invitation to be a part of the conversation this afternoon. As we're bridging from WIOA and talking about local workforce boards, obviously the system itself has been waiting for reauthorization since 2019, and we've got proposals that have passed the House, and things are heating up rapidly on the Senate side on that space. But I think one of the things that's interesting from a local board perspective, I was in Fort Worth earlier this week, meeting with Dallas and all the boards sort of in the Metroplex. And aside from the reauthorization conversations, one of the things that in this non-degree kind of credential space, the conversations that they've begun to really lean into, it was talked a little bit about sort of in the open mic time, is working with their business partners to really in the evolution and shift in talent acquisition and management and advancement to be much more skills based. And what does that look like from their business partners sort of community? What do they think? And one of the things that I picked up on that's relevant, I think, for this conversation is that the business community oftentimes is really they've adopted language over the years that's come from academia to reflect, sort of to articulate what the skills are or the competencies they need, but they aren't really the actual competencies they need. And so there's another level of disconnect, I think, in the earlier conversations around kind of the role that the business community needs to be involved in these conversations, because there's a lot of really deep internal analysis I think that companies need to do around really understanding what are the actual competency sets, because we've been using language because we haven't had to do that hard work on our own to sort of get to that space. So boards are in those spaces and in those kinds of conversations, which I think is really sort of important and significant. Then when you think about their fiduciary responsibilities around supporting people to access the competency building opportunities, whether it be through community colleges or other systems through the ETPLs, those kinds of things, they want to be really strategic in terms of helping people, the individuals, to be able to really benefit from the training to get to, I guess that's sort of the classic middle skill type job where they're providing for themselves. The individuals are providing for themselves and their families in the way that they want, right? Boards are trying to figure out how to do that. And I will fully own the fact, number one, I've been in this slot since September. Number two, I know that there are crappy boards and I know that there are amazing boards, right? So I apologize if the board in your area is like one of the crappy ones, and move to a place where there's a good one, because I am dedicated, and David's known me for a good long time. I am dedicated to raising the bar over all of those things through lots of different types of supports that NAWB has not done before. And so anyway, raising the bar is part of what we're doing. But in general, I think workforce boards are sort of stuck in the middle of this. They struggle. I appreciate the comments about chips and infrastructure clean. Like, they struggle to find their way in because those agencies weren't mandated in the law to engage workforce boards. And so they're all building their own stupid systems, not stupid in terms of intelligence, but just like, why? There's a public workforce system, leverage it. But they're not mandated to do it. And so they're building their own things. And so there's confusion and questions in the marketplace about how do we do that effectively. There are instances where they bridge that very well, and other places where they really struggled. So I think there's so much sort of disruption and evolution sort of happening in this space, completely outside of what's a badge versus a micro credential. right? And there's so much disruption, and boards are a part of those conversations and trying to find their way, and they're just as confused as everybody else. So anyway, I will stop there, turn to my colleagues. I think we probably will then sort of begin to sort of pop back and forth between various issues that we may raise, but I am happy to pass the mic.
Iris Palmer. I'm Director for Community Colleges at New America. I will just say we are a sort of research and advocacy organization, not like research like at a university, definitely different than that, a little more qualitative. And we also don't necessarily have a constituency the same way an association does. So I'm just going to lay that out there as some context for what I'm going to say about our current federal situation. So I want to thank Andrew for actually highlighting some of the data that's out there, because I think that a lot of times if there is no constituency for that data, it does disappear, and that we've seen that at the Department of Education. Obviously, we're seeing it at NSF and some of these other places. And so it's important for folks like you to understand that it's out there, to be using it and advocating for it with the departments and with the executive branch, frankly. So I'll put that there. If we're going to talk a little bit more about the large moves towards, I would say, general sort of vouchers for tuition around short-term programs. So let me put some definition on that. Right now, if it's a 4-credit program, Pell covers 15 weeks. If your training program is 15 weeks, you can be Pell eligible. There is a push in Congress to make that much less, around 8 weeks, I believe, although David will correct me. And also at the same time, too long. It should just be like 1 week. Why do we even have limits? And there's also a push at the same time in the WIOA reauthorization that was hinted at to really increase individual training accounts through the workforce system. So this idea that we're going to make that much bigger. I will just say that I think that there's limited evidence that short-term training programs and even training programs through the workforce system lead to family sustaining wages. Generally speaking, there's lots of research out there. We actually need more. I think that should be at the top of the research agenda here. And what we do see in the limited evidence we have as having impact of helping people with family sustaining wages is structural investments in our public training providers. So not having vouchers, but actually investing in the structures of community colleges in this case, because that's where I'm coming from. And so I would say if we could supersize the strengthening institution program in Title III of HEA, create a supersized TACT grant program, really invest in the community college training program, or the ETA community college partnership program. God, I have it written down here because I knew I'd forget. The strengthening community college partnership grant, which thanks Jared for that program. It's wonderful, but it needs to be much, much bigger. So the original sort of sin, I would say, in creating our federal aid system is that we did decide we were going to create a voucherized system rather than sort of an institution-based system. So I would say our perspective is we really need to supersize those other programs. Now, politically, that's very difficult to do / almost impossible. But what I would put in front of you all is that actually starting to do research around investments that are sector-based partnerships, apprenticeship, some of these more structured pathways into family sustaining wages, while also thinking about those structural investments in the institutions that are actually making these decisions and offering high quality programs to their students is really the right direction for the federal government to be investing in workforce, rather than sort of supersizing the sort of voucher programs that we have right now. This is an unpopular position, I will just say up here. But I do think it's the right one, given the evidence that we currently have. And I think we should continue to build the evidence base and translate it and try to make it more politically palatable. Although obviously investing in institutions is much less politically palatable than investing in students. And we know that. And I would say if it's nothing, I'm like, invest all the money in tuition vouchers, sure. but I actually think it would be much better to use our resources in this other direction, particularly as we build the research base around that. So with that sort of bomb, which David knew I would say, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to him so he can rebut me.
No, what I was going to say is it must be nice to take positions without members out there who are watching what positions you take. No, thank you, Iris. We are in fact extremely grateful and a grateful person for all the wonderful work that Iris and New America have done on behalf of community colleges, even though we do have to agree to disagree on certain topics, particularly the establishment of the short-term Pell eligibility, the programs that are less than currently 15 weeks, as we were just talking about. But so I have a lot of disparate things I wanted to mention this afternoon. Maybe I'll just pick up from what Iris just said, which is that it's true that aid to institutions as a general proposition is not popular with Congress. Certain programs you can get them done. We just talked about the Strengthening Community College Training Grant Program. There was the TAC program, which was a larger program, was a 4-year program. It was basically the consolation prize when Barack Obama's American Graduation Initiative collapsed in 2010. But it still provided a wonderful amount of infrastructure and program development, as well as training people across the country. And one of the things that it did, just as a model for future policy, was that it essentially required state systems of community colleges to work together to develop programs, or they were much advantaged by competing for funds that way. So that's an example of a federal policy leading to some real and I think maybe lasting institutional change. When we think about this space of non-degree credentials and what the federal government is doing, I think the first thing to recognize is that immediately we're drawn to what are these programs' outcomes? What do they deliver? How much they change people's earnings and their career pathways? And I would just note that this is a standard that is not applied to every other higher education program that is funded through the Higher Education Act, which is where the money is in terms of supporting post-secondary education students. If you have an accredited program that is a non-GE program, which is the certificates at our community colleges and for-profit programs, essentially you get a pass in terms of the outcomes of your programs. And I think it drives us crazy, frankly. It just makes us, it's maddening that there is this extraordinary expectation about outcomes for training programs or workforce education programs. And basically nobody gives a talk about what happens to students who invest far more of their time going to degree programs. They might be community college degree programs, they might be 4-year college degree programs. But there is a real blindness in terms of what the federal government does in this area. And one of the other things where I think the Biden administration deserves some credit is that they are trying to address this through this financial value transparency framework that they are creating. The first reporting will become due for institutions on October 1. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this, every program that is Title IV eligible will have to report for every one of its Title IV recipients some data on those recipients, when they started, if they dropped out, when that happened, when they completed, and then there will be a match done with the earnings of all of those students. And if the numbers are large enough to create cells that can be displayed publicly, there will be, across all our higher education, data about how programs are performing in terms of what debt to earnings and relative to high school earnings in the state. And so this is maybe not transformative because unfortunately, not all students can be included in this data system. You may be aware that there's a prohibition on a national unit record data system. And that's one area where we agree on, right? We agree that that would be a good thing. So we'd like to see this national system, but CTAs, but Dr. Virginia Fox, who's the chairman of the House Education Workforce Committee, is and has been adamantly opposed to the establishment of this national unit record data system. She will be leaving her position as committee chair. I think it's the 90% of higher education, with the exception of some of the private colleges, not even all of them, but they happen to be very influential, have somehow persuaded Dr. Fox and a few others that somehow being included in a federal data system is an invasion of privacy or and requires the government to know things about students that they shouldn't otherwise know. It's ridiculous in a myriad of ways now, but one of the ways that it's ridiculous is that these same data are being captured for all your Title IV recipients. And so, so you have 70% of all the private college students, about 40% of our students are in the system, but the other ones aren't. And so the data that are generated, and we're talking about the Title IV recipients, are incomplete and not really representative of program quality, but from the national level in terms of what we know, it basically comes from these Title IV data. So looking a little bit more narrowly then about the current discussion over the workforce Pell Grant, as we call it, and admittedly, as Iris was just saying, the data are lacking in terms of nationally, what these programs outcomes are. You all know that. I mean, that's one of the reasons for this group even, existing. And it undermines our advocacy efforts in terms of being able to document the outcomes of these programs. But having said that, and getting back maybe to the first point that I made about the fact that there's really no meaningful discussion at all in the policy world, really, as well as up on the Hill, about what the yield should be on an English BA at Kutztown State University versus an English BA at more selective college versus an engineering degree from those two institutions. No real policy around that at all. However, when there has been policy discussion about these short-term programs, because they're not being funded now, so there's been this months-long debate about whether they should be funded, and if so, on what conditions would these programs become eligible. And my organization has been excruciatingly, it's not exaggeration to say, and extensively involved in negotiating these. And I say this to kind of illustrate the point that they really don't know that the staff people, the members who are writing these bills, I mean, they know less than probably just about everybody in this room does about what data are out there, and really much less, if you were to have the data, what would be a fair evaluation of these programs. Okay, so we have pending now, that came out of the House Education Committee in December, the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, which it was great that it was a bipartisan bill. Bobby Scott joined with Dr. Fox on this legislation. It includes for-profit institutions, which is taboo for many Democratic members, including Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Dick Durbin. So we're not real optimistic about getting a bill like that through the Senate. But the bill that was bipartisan that came out of the committee in the House included, we're talking about programs that are less than 2/3 of a year in length. And let's remember that with the exception of gainful employment, the Higher Education Act is silent otherwise on what the outcomes, expected outcomes or standards might be for those other programs. So for our workforce Pell, though, you have to meet a 70% completion. You have to meet a 70% placement rate. You have to meet two different earning standards, one proposed by the Democrats and one proposed by the Republicans. That's bipartisan. You have to be on the eligible training provider list through WIOA. You have to be approved by a state workforce board. You have to meet accreditation standards. If you're a non-credit program, you have to articulate into a credit program. So this slew of requirements would be provided on these short-term programs, which are designed for poor people to try to get a little leg up in our economy, do a little bit better, whereas the government is happy to shovel thousands of dollars of subsidies to students attending liberal arts programs. And I graduated from liberal arts programs, and like many graduates, I floundered a while, after getting out of school. But there's nothing the government had to say about that. So, I mean, you get from what I'm saying that we do think that there is an incredible double standard and really a misallocation of resources, if you want to say that what people should be thinking about in terms of value that's provided for these programs is where we are right now. Maybe the last thing that I would say is that because I know industry certifications, badges, and whatnot are part of this conversation, is that because the federal government basically works, and as it very much has to, sort in a numbers way in evaluating programs to the extent that it does. I mean, you've got the data have to be numbers, something that's comparable, quantifiable. That the integration of things like industry certifications and badges, and even to some extent licensure, is something that we have had a difficult time getting done through federal policy because basically not every industry, not every profession has comparable credentials that could be provided. Even if you said that you wanted to bring into this conversation, which again is, it's always easier for just to rely on numbers. But if you wanted to say, well, we'll make your program eligible if you have an industry cert, for example, that's not something that on a broad basis has been able to be done. And so that is, I think, maybe like the next stage that we would like to see at some point that included. And I'll just close by saying one idea that we had that we got some people interested in on the Hill before this slew of requirements was dropped onto the short-term Pell discussion was to actually allow a program to be qualified through different means. So if you had an industry cert that was appropriately recognized by a national body, that would be sufficient to make your program qualify. If you showed a skills bump of a certain percentage, that should be enough to have you qualify. If you had a licensure pathway to something where there's a licensure examination, that too would be some way to make you eligible rather than having a laundry list of things, which is unfortunately basically as passed. They're wondering about how many of our programs even would qualify under it. And we don't like to say it very loud publicly, but we know we may have some disappointed community college presidents out there saying, BAME, you know, you're up there in Washington and this is what you came home with for us, you know, because it's a lot of hoops that the colleges would have to get through on this. So those are some of the things that we think about in the policy space.
I just want to grab something real quick. When you in the conversation, David, that you were talking about with Dr. Fox's retirement and then possibly opening the door around a different conversation from a more universal sort of education type record. The other piece that boards are thinking about as well is the intersection between that sort of an opportunity and thinking more broadly and more strategically about workforce information systems and how those two things come together to support, without any real definition to it, the construct of the digital wallet that the individual worker, you know, you can take that, and then there's some agreed upon sort of taxonomies that are being worked on by lots of people that are a hell of a lot smarter than I am to figure out how you can carry that to give to an employer to show your education, your competency set, your skills, the things you've achieved, and that employers can understand what's in that, and then they can add to your digital wallet as you're building skills demonstrated there. But those kinds of pieces of the conversation are connected to the non-degree credential world. And so boards are also sort of in that space. So when you mentioned that piece about Dr. Fox retiring and that, you know, whether it would happen or not, who knows, but but that's also kind of on the forefront for folks, is thinking about how do we prepare for that sort of a talent exchange, if you would.
So I'm gonna first ask maybe David can answer this in the context of the financial thing. More data collection, great. You know, what could go wrong? Who would object to collecting more data? I think that some of us in the NCRN, you know, were somewhat surprised actually there was as much pushback as there was from some institutions from adding the collection of non-credit data to iPads. So I'm just kind of curious, you know, in terms of this new reporting, is there pushback from your members? Is there concern? You mentioned that not all students are included equally. Is that a concern that's
What a couple of things. First of all, we think it was extremely unfortunate that the non-credit question was excluded after we thought that it was going to be included in iPads. We knew all the arguments against it in terms of that it wasn't the tightest definition. It wouldn't be the most consistent definition across institutions, but we certainly thought that it was a very worthwhile, would have been a very worthwhile start. In terms of the data collection question, I would say that our institutions are very frustrated, in particular by these new financial value transparency requirements that are coming online. And I think that policymakers in general, I won't limit it just to data collection, although that can be, you know, can involve huge requirements. but that they are oftentimes just blind to the institutional impact of requirements that they enact. And I'll just give you an example, because it touches maybe a little bit on the interests of this group, which is that the department has coming online this July, a regulation that was just finalized at October 31st, which requires institutions to limit the length of their courses under gainful employment programs to the minimum length to practice or be licensed in this state for a gainful employment program. So if the state says you need to study for 6 months for a vet tech program, and Dallas College's vet tech program is 7.5 months, they have to shorten that program to 6 months. And they gave institutions 8 months to comply with that. We all know the complexities and the time that it takes to change programs, even if you wanted to. So even just setting aside what we think is a draconian, just an unfair policy on institutions. So I mention that because it's a reality that our institutions are facing right now, but also an example of, now that's not Congress, that's the U.S. Department of Education, but like who dreamed up that idea? And like, you go to the campus and you work with the faculty and the state licensing board and the accreditors, and you shorten that program in 8 months' time. So upbeat this afternoon here.
Cold and raining.
I'm kind of curious if any of the panelists or anybody else in the room is aware of where things are going with the non-credit data collection. Obviously, right now it's voluntary. Do we expect that to become mandatory still in the coming years? Is it something we'll wait and see after the election? Yeah.
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
It's a non-Title IV thing for iPads.
Remind us, was there a TRP panel?
Yeah, there was. Yeah.
And the bottom line, the conclusion was, the bottom line was the TRP suggested to do it. NCS submitted the clearance package on me that had non-credit in it. After the 60 days, they watered it down a little bit. After the 30-day final, did that
No.
look like it was reaction to letters from outside? I'm not sure. We're all very good with Tommy, had to do with that. The excuse me gave them time.
We think it was pressure from, I'll just say, non-community colleges. That was leverage on. You could come up with arguments, like I said, about it, but it was, we think it was a terribly, learning opportunity on the part of the.
Doing, there are a lot of people out there who didn't want people to know how much non-credit they were doing. You look at like Newark University, they have a book this thick on non-credit offerings.
Yeah.
So,
I was gonna say that. I think
it's couched as one thing and it may be something else.
if I had to guess, I would guess it was 4-year continuing ed programs, but I don't know that for sure. That would be my intuition.
I would just say, so I'm Melanie Gottlieb. I work with ACRO, which is the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admission Officers. And so in this particular conversation, we know that the mechanism by which most of our institutions report to iPads using the National Student Clearinghouse, using NCES data, that the clearinghouse is preparing for this. So the data structures will be there at the point at which the switch gets flipped. We're supportive of it so long as institutions are given enough time to get their data in order. because there is a huge gap between record keeping at for-credit programs and record keeping and non-credit programs. And we need to fix that issue. And that is something that we're actively working with UPSIA to get our members to talk with their members and try to clean up what's happening or not happening in that space.
Yeah, even in community colleges, oftentimes a non-credit is a separate database, ERP, than the others. And they oftentimes don't have student identifiers. Sometimes they don't have unique IDs for them. So doing unduplicated head count is, which is why in the OMB clearance, it just counts of seat time, not head count.
I think there's also a parallel conversation. We've been talking a lot about iPads in terms of enrollments, but there's also completions, which is a different conversation. And I think there might be some exploration around mechanisms to get at non-degree credentials or non-credit. That I don't know is as far along as what we saw with the enrollment side. So I just put that out there. I
That's
don't know.
much
Do you know
further
more?
away.
Yeah. Okay. More to come.
I didn't mean to steer us too off topic with with iPads, but it's certainly something that I think has been I think that was one of our more successful sort of letter writing campaigns. And Andrew?
I want to bring up another topic. It relates to what
Yeah.
which is back to the industrial policy and strategy. I just want to, I'm going to try a 3-minute industrial policy 101 to people. My background is in regional economic development, so I work with cities and states for 20 years, in which we're trying to figure out what are the key industries in the state, in Austin, Texas, and in the state of Colorado, and what do they need to be competitive. And of course, workforce is always part of that. But in states and regions, everyone knows each other, right? So you can sit down with the people at the university and the employers and work out how they can collaborate with each other so that supply and demand match up. It's not how the federal government works, right? The federal government works in silos. And we looked at, I showed you the report. So for 60 years, the government has worked in silos. If you're a federal employee, you get punished if you wander outside of your silo. But so there's a difference between policy, in which we have a policy around Perkins or WIBS or whatever, and strategy, in which we want to be competitive in global markets around chips. And being competitive, U.S. used to have competitiveness policies up until the 1920s. It's been 100 years. And the key tool was tariffs, which is a kind of clumsy. And these days we have a lot more tools, but it requires the federal government to learn new tricks, which is to get the people who are trying to manage America's capacity to produce chips to talk to the workforce people who are running the programs, who before had no supervision around key industries. And so which requires moving from the vertical to the horizontal, where agencies are talking to each other, which is for a lot of agencies an unnatural act. And so how do you facilitate that process? Because the way that programs are set up, there's a book I recommend. It's an easy read called Fluke, F-L-U-K-E. And the author just came out, makes a distinction between convergence and contingency. So most federal programs are set up to converge on a happy outcome. We want people in the community to be trained in jobs that are in demand, and we set up these processes for the WIBs to identify in-demand occupations. Here's the money, here's what you got to do it. And the idea is the community will move to a better place or reduce poverty or so forth. Industrial strategy requires the capacity to respond to contingent events, like the president was in Wisconsin earlier this week, cutting the ribbon on the $3 billion AI facility, which needs people. Now, we didn't know that thing was going to be there, but all of a sudden you can imagine the people in Wisconsin scrambling to figure out how they're going to have to find a skilled workforce. And they couldn't make the announcement without knowing at least they had a chance of getting those people. So how can the workforce community, including all you, work with folks at the local level to respond to contingent events of the government laying down $6 billion to Ford to build a electric vehicles battery plant, or to Arizona building a TSMC semiconductor plant, which needs thousands of people. And so there is an effort to move from running programs that are based on formulas to actually give people the capacity to make judgments in real time. And so there's, how many people here know Christoph Kambamale at Carnegie Mellon? Okay, so Christoph is being hired by the Department of Energy. All these plants are having to be created. And Columbus, Ohio is supposed to build a chips plant. How many people are trained in Columbus right now to walk into that chips plant? Not enough. And so what Christoph is doing is taking ONET and looking at occupational employment in Columbus and saying, who's in what occupations that are close enough to semiconductors that they can get trained for what they don't know? And are there enough people? That's pretty reasonable. And then you have to find them and target them. But this is kind of all on the fly. It's not by formula. And academics can play a great role in this process, but it's leaning into market mechanisms. Just say for all this stuff to work, the $52 billion in chips, this kind of reactive on the fly reaction to contingency in a productive way is a necessity. It won't work without.
So, not only are these agencies that have all this money from the CHIPS and Science Act and from the Infrastructure Act and from other acts, not talking to DOL and the sort of workforce system writ large, they also have never worked with community colleges before. They are very, very, very four-year research focused, and that's who they're used to working with, particularly NSF, who we've already mentioned today. And aside from one program at NSF, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, but across the agency, they don't know about community colleges, and they certainly don't know about it in the new TIP directorate that was created in the CHIPS and Science Act. We are hopefully going to be launching a community of practice for community colleges who are named in the NSF Engines program. So the NSF Engines program is a 10-year, $150 million grant program run through the NSF, where it's basically focused on this economic development and some of these, I mean, it's more about economic development than I would say probably industrial policy, although Andrew, you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong. And really trying to cement the connection between the named two-year institutions and the actual activity that's going on the ground through those grants. Because what we're afraid is that the NSF forced people to name two-year colleges in these applications, and they won't actually be engaged in any way. And thus you will never get the technician level people trained to actually do the thing that the engine's supposed to be doing. And so we're trying to support some of that connection and sort of connect the NSF to and the engine heads to these community colleges in their world. Yeah.
Sure.
So good, thank you. So innovation engines, as Iris is saying, NSF, the TIP directorate, has a lot of money to hand out for place-based economic development. But Iris, it's actually both, because they're supposed to hand out the money to South Carolina or to Atlanta to help the nation be competitive. This is not about bringing back places that were, that lost a lot of jobs. It's partly that, but it's this particular community has a competitive advantage in this particular technology that the nation needs. Now, back to the horizontal stuff, the innovation engines is a clusters program. It's how you're going to bring the researchers and the manufacturers and the community colleges together to build this capacity in a region to respond to contingent events in global markets. It turns out that the federal government, Congress, has funded 5 clusters programs in 5 different agencies. So the Economic Development Administration and Commerce has the tech hubs. And there's an MOU between the tech hubs and the innovation engines, but SBA has regional innovation clusters. Department of Defense has microeconomic. And the Department of Energy has something called EPIC, which I forget what it stands for, but it's energy. Are they talking to each other?
I'd like to get in like a cross-cutting question as we kind of wind down the panel here. That is for each of you. We, in the spirit of, I think, the vision that Steve Crawford and I had 5 years ago in this room of stakeholders talking to the research community. What are the priorities? How can researchers be part of finding solutions to policy problems? What's the research study that you're craving, I guess? What would you like to find if you had a doctoral student work interning in your office, could send them out for a year to do work that was really going to advance policy for each of you and your respective organizations? What would that be?
I can answer, but I want to.
Yeah, I would
spoke,
think, I
so
would think it's kind of unfair for
yeah, yeah.
start with Whip.
Other people talk first.
Yeah. You guys want
Sure. So, I, I don't know. I mean, there's probably a couple of different levels of sort of question. I think there's, from a known data perspective, I think being able to uh, really one thing might be where, so the workforce information advisory councils group that it's engaged with. I don't know how much you all sort of connect to or engaged with them in terms of really informing sort of use of LMI, speed of LMI. That's from a strategic perspective, figuring out how to, and this was just part of the comments I think previously. There's employment related data that sits inside Social Security, and it's in DOL, and it's in other places. And the system, the network of workforce boards system writ large, right, really struggles from an ability to adjust and be timely, um, because of lags and the silos that exist between departments, where if you could figure out how to bridge those silos, you could accelerate some things. I think that could be really powerful for our system. In terms of the actual research piece, I think that would be really compelling. It does have to do with the I appreciate your comment a little bit earlier, but I was on the phone this morning with the Career Source Florida, in Northeast Florida, and their data sets come out with that individuals who come through and engage with training through the workforce board in Northeast Florida, 2 quarters post exit, they earn more than $10,000 than per quarter than they would have without engaging, right? And so there's a pressure testing that I think is valid, but I think leaning into around the space of how do we communicate those things better. And there's a speed component of that. How do I get the data more quickly? And then how do I use that to really communicate the impact and then identify those places where actually there really is improvement. Data is a great thing to help debunk big swath pictures of things. And I think the workforce system struggles with that. Because it gets characterized broadly in lots of ways by lots of folks in a pretty, and oftentimes a negative light. But yet there are so many pockets. Again, I was in Fort Worth earlier this week. Amazing stuff that's happening there, where they've got almost a $20,000 earnings per year differential for individuals who've gone through training, engaged with the workforce system in that market. That's life-changing for people. And so anyway, so helping us think about in that sort of those spaces. I don't know if that's a doctoral student going out and doing stuff someplace, but those are the kinds of things that we think about that could be really helpful from a workforce board perspective. There's probably other things that I will sort of think about and come up with while my colleagues sort of offer their insights, but that's what I would have at this point.
So I'm not sure, I mean, does the data have to exist is the question, but I will just put that aside for a second. I think there is more work to be done looking at different regions, different types of programs, different lengths of programs, and what the impact of training is compared to what. and who and all of that. Like, I think there's a ton more work to be done there. I think about some of the work that was done through CAPC a few years ago and CCRC. All of that needs to be updated, broadened to more states, and really looking at like, where is there value in the shorter term programs, in which occupations, from which providers, in what modalities, like, and what does value mean? What are we talking about? Are we talking about growth in wages? Are we talking about an absolute living wage that people are getting to? Are we talking about over what period of time? I think all of that needs a lot more work. And at the same time, I think there needs to be more work in different types of sectoral training and other types of pathways that are more structured and less just like go get a certificate program, then figure it out, but actually are attached to jobs that are already there with employers that are already looking to hire. I mean, I actually think this is also true in the Title IV system all the way up through bachelor's degrees, which are the only credential in higher education that we do not measure labor market outcomes on. Everything else is considered training for the workforce, including all post-secondary, all graduate school is all training for the workforce. It's only bachelor's degrees that are held to this weird standard where they're not about the workforce. And I frankly think there needs to be a lot more studies on that too. And we're seeing it more and more in the public consciousness as they're charging more and more for bachelor's degrees. And so I think studies around all of that need to happen. And that's not just one. Sorry, Kyle.
So
But, we are getting close to the point where we're encroaching on the reception.
I did think of one more. One of the things in the House bill that is now actually a consideration on the Senate side as well. You may be familiar with the provision around in training. I think you mentioned sort of a larger substantive investment in training. So the adult Title I and dislocated worker funds, there's a provision in the House bill that would require our local workforce board. It mandates them to spend 50% of those dollars on training, which is a hell of a lot, regardless of whether it's needed or not in that particular area, right? So you're taking autonomy away from a local board. I have a whole thing on that. But one of the things that I think would be really helpful from a research perspective is anecdotally, I've lived it. I know it to be true. I know this. I believe it to be true. I don't know it to be true. I believe it to be true. I see it enough happen where the importance of the wraparound support services to get somebody to completion. Like we talk about that, how like the stuff that gets in the way of somebody keeping a job is the same stuff that gets in the way of somebody not completing a degree program or a credential program, right? It's childcare. It's all those other things. In the conversation that happens on the Hill on this issue around mandating workforce boards to spend 50% of their training funds, 50% of their funds on training, is the fact that we don't have data that says, like, if you do that, you're actually going to really, cripple the number of individuals who can actually go through training because you're taking all the wraparound support services that local workforce boards. I mean, I was at David's conference earlier this year with the Workforce Development Institute. Like all the funds that workforce boards use as wraparound support services for those community college students, those are gone. Those are gone. They're off the table. And so, but I need research to really validate what I know to be true. So that would be one specific one. Sorry, I didn't mean to sort of grab that one, but it did pop up for me. So I will give you the mic so I won't grab it again. But go ahead, David.
I'm going to be super brief, and I'm really just going to repeat in very telegraph form what Brad and Iris said, which is that I think this is outside the purview of this group and maybe any group, but that I think the decision-making process that individuals go through as they decide whether and how to participate in post-secondary education and which program they enroll in is probably the thing that we know the least about, that we need to know the most about, because as everybody knows, the program that you enroll in is so consequential. And then in terms of, earnings and other things. And then I do think that on this debate about short-term programs, it's true that a lot of the data that we'd like to have aren't there, but because we want to spend many more months frittering away arguing each other. Now we need to have a little bit more data on, or a lot more data on, as Iris was pointed out so well, the differences between the various programs and how they're offered and so forth.
Yeah. I have a proposal. For NCRN.
Okay.
I'm going to take 90 seconds.
Okay.
Which is context, right? For a lot of researchers in academia, they do not have incentives to do research that is actually applicable because it's not good for a peer-reviewed journal article, or for a lot of academics, they care about what they think other academics in their field think of them, and getting involved in public policy is not something that raises people's status. So a model that I'm trying to play with is can the NCRN create a little marketplace where you bring together 5 or 6 of these agencies in DOL, education, and energy and commerce, and ask them what they would like to know? And then, right, most people here are at universities that have programs with capstone projects, and put the students to work. So this is not peer-reviewed journal article quality research, but it's a way to get the academics people who are running capstones are always looking for ways to get in, to not work that hard, and get the students working on stuff that the agencies can find useful. And again, context, under the Evidence Act of 2018, every agency is supposed to come up with a learning agenda. What questions do they want to answer? So they are supposed to come up with their own research agenda. And NCRN can, if there's room in the Lumina grant, is to you just do a little playpen where you make it 5 NCRN members and 5 agencies, but see if you can create a back and forth where relationships get built, because the agencies then know people in academia and they say, hey, I got this other question for you. And that make the research demand.
Exactly. Well, thank you all so much. Great panel. Thank you. Michelle, do you want to do a few final remarks for the day?
Sure. Oh, say them very loud. So yes, I know we are at time, but I was just going to reflect. I think that was kind of our wrap up here. Is we just wanted to share some reflections on the themes from the day. And I think for me, just thinking about all the conversations we've had over today, I think one general theme comes out for me is that this is a rapidly changing environment. I think that's not news to anybody, but I think actually if we think about all the panel discussions we've had today, we've really captured a lot of those changes that are happening. We've got a rapidly shifting policy environment with a lot of things happening. We've got a lot of new standards and ideas about standards and systems around standards for quality that are developing and emerging. We've got data systems and new kinds of sources of data that are also emerging. We've got technology, really cool to hear about some of the new technology for how we can use this AI and machine learning and all these different things that can help us make sense of this. So that was really exciting, I think, today, and really a valuable discussion. Another theme I think is just all the complexity of all of this and this non-degree credential landscape. There's so much complexity, and there's a want and a need for us to drive to collaboration and consistency, while also sort of recognizing and maintaining the integrity of the complexity, because it's there for a reason in some sense, but there's sort of a balance between the two is my observation. So anyway, and then wonderful discussion about the future directions of the NCRN. So I hope that everyone, continues to think about that and has written down some ideas on those cards we had on the table and handed those in, and we'll go home and continue to think about ideas and send them to us as we continue to develop the strategic planning process and figure out where NCRN is going to go. So that's my 2 cents, and Kyle probably has some other good thoughts to wrap us up and to join us for a reception. So.
I don't want to stand in the way of the reception, to be honest. Other than just sincere appreciation to everyone for staying to the end. This is actually, I think, we have not had nearly as much during the day as we've had at previous conferences. So, thank you all. And obviously, the NCRN would be what it is without its members, all of you. We sincerely hope to see you again, same time next year. And we hope you'll all be involved and engaged in the webinars. Please contact Michelle or contact me if you're interested in volunteering, present at a webinar. That's we're always have a need for new presenters. So that would be great. And in the meantime, feel free, please do stay engaged. If thoughts come to mind about our strategic planning process, about what we could be doing better, how we could become more sustainable, please send those thoughts our way. Other than that, thank you all.